Welcome, brave soul, to a place where the air is thick with mystery and the dead have stories to tell. Tonight, I'll uncover 3 creepy, untold cemetery stories you've never heard. Tales that will send shivers crawling down your spine. But before we step into the shadows of the graveyard, don't forget to subscribe and join our journey into the unknown. The cemetery was cloaked in a ghostly silence, the kind that seemed alive with anticipation. Among the weathered tombstones, the figure of an old caretaker could sometimes be seen, his translucent form pacing the grounds. Long ago, he had vowed to protect the resting souls, and even in death, he kept his word. His lantern glowed with an eerie greenish light, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Visitors often spoke of feeling watched, their necks prickling under his unseen gaze. Some claimed they heard the faint sound of shovels scraping dirt, as though he still tended to the graves. Though his presence wasn't malevolent, those who dared linger too long reported waking nightmares, vivid images of their own graves, as if he was warning them of their mortality. It was said that the winds in the graveyard carried voices, faint and fragmented like broken memories. On particularly quiet nights, the whispers grew louder, forming disjointed phrases that chilled the heart. "Not yet. Stay away. Watch the shadows," they seemed to say. Skeptics dismissed it as the wind brushing through the trees, but those who listened closely heard unmistakable tones of despair and urgency. Locals avoided the cemetery during windy nights, fearing they might hear their own names whispered on the breeze. One tale spoke of a woman who followed the voices and vanished, leaving behind only her shoes at the edge of the graveyard. To this day, the wind there has a voice of its own, carrying the stories of those long gone. At the farthest edge of the graveyard, hidden by overgrown ivy and leaning trees, stood a grave with no name. The tombstone was plain and weathered, its surface devoid of any inscription. It became the subject of ghost stories passed down through generations. Children dared each other to touch it, claiming it would curse them with nightmares. One man, intrigued by its mystery, dug through historical records to uncover its story, but found nothing. No burial records, no family claims. Some believe the grave belongs to someone buried in secret, a person whose very existence was meant to be erased. The area around the grave felt colder, and animals avoided it altogether. Visitors swore they saw faint lights hovering above the soil, as if the spirit buried there was trying to reclaim its lost identity. There was a particular grave in the cemetery that no one could explain. The soil above it was perpetually loose, as if freshly disturbed. Gravediggers avoided it, muttering about strange occurrences when they came too close. On some nights, faint sounds could be heard emanating from it, scratching, like nails against wood. Brave souls who investigated found nothing but unearthed soil and an overwhelming sense of dread. Legends grew around the grave, with some claiming it belonged to a wrongfully buried victim or a restless spirit seeking justice. Others whispered that the grave was a doorway to a darker realm, where the dead could not find peace. Whatever the truth, the grave remained a source of fear, a reminder that not all who are buried rest in peace. At the stroke of midnight, the cemetery came alive with an unearthly sight. A ghostly funeral procession would materialize, its figures clad in tattered, otherworldly garments. They moved silently, carrying a coffin that emitted a faint bluish glow. The procession would weave through the graveyard, vanishing at an unmarked grave at the center. Those who witnessed it described feeling frozen in place, unable to move or speak until the specters disappeared. The procession always followed the same path, as if reenacting a forgotten tragedy. Locals believed it was a cursed funeral, doomed to repeat forever due to some unspeakable sin. The coffin, they said, was empty, waiting for a soul to fill it. Witnesses rarely returned to the cemetery, haunted by the memory of those silent figures. Legends spoke of the ghostly caretaker who would appear to those who wandered the cemetery late at night. His presence was neither menacing nor kind, but his warning was clear: leave before it's too late. Those who ignored him reported vivid nightmares, dreams of being trapped among the tombstones, unable to leave. The caretaker's lantern, with its flickering spectral glow, became a beacon of both guidance and fear. Some claimed he protected visitors from the cemetery's darker entities, while others believed he simply ensured no one disturbed the rest of the dead. His final warning was said to echo in the minds of those he approached, a haunting reminder to respect the boundary between the living and the dead. Ethan wasn't thrilled about the job, but it paid the bills. The Hollow Pine Cemetery was vast and ancient, its tombstones weathered and cracked from centuries of rain and wind. Stories whispered around town claimed the cemetery had a life of its own. Locals spoke of ghostly lights, chilling whispers, and figures lurking in the shadows. Ethan had always dismissed these tales as nonsense. That night, the mist hung low, curling around the headstones like grasping fingers. As Ethan walked the uneven paths with his flashlight, every crunch of gravel under his boots felt deafening in the silence. The usual calm of the cemetery felt wrong. Shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. He shook it off, attributing it to nerves. Then he noticed the first sign: a faint glow near the cemetery's edge. Squinting, Ethan moved closer. It wasn't a lantern or a firefly. It pulsed softly, almost like it was breathing. His skin prickled. A low whisper echoed faintly, carried by the wind. Just a trick of the mind, Ethan muttered to himself, quickening his pace. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. As Ethan ventured further into the cemetery, he stumbled upon something that made him stop in his tracks. A grave, freshly disturbed, lay in stark contrast to the others. The soil was dark and loose, as though it had been recently dug up. The headstone, split down the middle, bore no name, just weathered symbols Ethan couldn't decipher. He shined his flashlight over the grave, his breath hitching as he noticed faint footprints leading away from the disturbed soil. They were too small to belong to an adult, yet their spacing suggested a hurried pace. Ethan's pulse quickened as he debated whether to follow. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest hint of decay. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward, following the prints deeper into the cemetery. The trees seemed to close in around him, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. A sudden rustling made him whip around, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. "Get it together," he muttered, though his voice sounded shaky even to his own ears. Still, the sense of being watched lingered. The footprints led Ethan to a part of the cemetery he rarely visited, the older section, where mausoleums stood like forgotten sentinels. His flashlight beam wavered, its batteries faltering. Shadows danced unnaturally against the weathered stone. Then he heard it, a faint whisper. At first he thought it was the wind, but the sound grew clearer. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping in a haunting symphony of murmurs. The words were incomprehensible, yet they made his skin crawl. The whispers seemed to beckon him toward the largest mausoleum at the cemetery's edge. Its iron doors were slightly ajar, creaking softly as they swayed in the breeze. Ethan hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But his curiosity won. Inside, the air was thick and cold. Dust motes floated in the weak beam of his flashlight. On the far wall, strange symbols were etched into the stone, glowing faintly. The whispers grew louder, filling the mausoleum with an unnatural hum. Ethan took a step back, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he'd stumbled into. but he was sure it wasn't meant to be found. Ethan's breath caught as a figure emerged from the shadows. Cloaked in black, with eyes that glinted like polished obsidian, the figure exuded an aura of menace and authority. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice a low growl. "I'm the caretaker," Ethan stammered, trying to mask his fear. The figure chuckled darkly. "A caretaker? You know nothing of what you care for. This place is no mere cemetery. It's a gateway, a prison for things that should never be freed." Ethan's mind reeled. The figure, who called himself the Keeper, explained that the disturbed grave and glowing symbols were the work of those seeking to open the gateway. If they succeeded, unimaginable horrors would be unleashed. Before Ethan could respond, the Keeper stepped back into the shadows, vanishing as if he were never there. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of the Keeper's warning sinking in. He had to stop whatever was happening, but he had no idea how. As Ethan stepped out of the mausoleum, he heard chanting, low and rhythmic, carried by the wind. Following the sound, he came across a group of hooded figures gathered around a glowing sigil carved into the ground. The air vibrated with energy, and the symbols pulsed with a malevolent light. Ethan hid behind a crumbling headstone, his heart pounding. He could hear fragments of the chant, their words ancient and guttural. The figures raised their hands toward the sky, their voices rising in unison. Ethan knew he had to act fast, but as he stepped closer, one of the figures turned, as though sensing his presence. Their hood fell back, revealing hollow, blackened eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. Ethan froze, unable to look away. The sigil's glow intensified, and the ground began to tremble. Whatever they were summoning was close to breaking through. Ethan clenched his fists, summoning every ounce of courage he had left. He wouldn't let them succeed. Ethan lunged forward, disrupting the ritual. He kicked dirt over the sigil, breaking its glow. The hooded figures screamed in unison, their chant faltering. But the ground beneath Ethan cracked open, and a monstrous shadow began to emerge. The Keeper appeared, his presence commanding and resolute. "This ends now," he said, raising a staff Ethan hadn't seen before. Light erupted from its tip, blinding and pure. The figures scattered, their cries echoing into the night. The Keeper chanted words Ethan couldn't comprehend. The shadow retreated, its form dissolving as the sigil crumbled. But the effort took its toll. The Keeper fell to his knees, his form flickering like a dying flame. "You must take my place," he whispered to Ethan. "Guard this place, and its secrets." With those final words, the Keeper vanished, leaving Ethan alone in the silent cemetery. He realized he was now the cemetery's new guardian, bound to its ancient and terrible legacy. The old Waverly Cemetery sat on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, shrouded in mist and mystery. Elena, a history student, had come to document its weathered headstones and uncover the stories behind them. The townsfolk warned her about the whispers said to drift through the graveyard after dark, but Elena dismissed the tales as local folklore. As she walked the overgrown paths, she noticed something odd. Every grave seemed marked by the same inscription: "Never forgotten." It sent a shiver down her spine, but she pressed on, snapping photos and jotting notes. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog thickened, curling around the gravestones like ghostly hands. Elena thought she heard faint murmurs, indistinct and fragmented. She froze, her breath visible in the chilly air. "Just the wind," she whispered to herself, though her heart began to race. But deep down, Elena knew. This was more than just the wind. Elena tried to leave as darkness fell, but the cemetery's rusted gate wouldn't budge. She rattled it desperately, but it seemed locked, though she hadn't noticed a lock earlier. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, forming faint words. Stay with us. Determined to find another way out, she retraced her steps. The paths she'd walked earlier now seemed unfamiliar, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. It was as if the cemetery itself was shifting. Her flashlight flickered, its beam weak against the encroaching darkness. She stumbled upon a large crypt she hadn't noticed before, its door slightly ajar. Carved above the entrance were the words, "The Keeper watches." A low hum emanated from within, and though every instinct told her to run, Elena felt compelled to enter. Inside the crypt, the air was cold and heavy. Dust hung thick, disturbed only by Elena's hesitant footsteps. Stone coffins lined the walls, their lids engraved with symbols she couldn't decipher. The whispers transformed into mournful cries, echoing off the walls. Elena's flashlight illuminated an old journal lying on an altar at the crypt's center. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was legible. It told the story of a gravedigger named Tomas, who had been tasked with burying the town's dead during a plague centuries ago. Overwhelmed and fearful of infection, he buried many in mass graves, alive. The cries grew louder, filling the crypt with anguished wails. Elena dropped the journal, horrified. She turned to leave, but found the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. As Elena pounded on the crypt door, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man in a tattered coat, his face pale and gaunt, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped. Elena demanded to know who he was, and he introduced himself as Thomas, the keeper of the cemetery. He confessed his guilt over the souls he had condemned, and explained that the whispers were their pleas for justice. The cemetery was cursed, bound by the sorrow of the forgotten dead. "The curse will only lift if the truth is unearthed," Thomas said. "But beware, those who seek it often pay a terrible price." Elena asked how she could help, but Thomas simply faded away, leaving her alone with the cries echoing louder than ever. Determined to end the curse, Elena followed the whispers, which seemed to guide her through the cemetery. They led her to a sunken patch of earth, hidden beneath tangled roots and ivy. Using her bare hands, she began to dig, the soil cold and damp under her fingers. After what felt like hours, she unearthed a wooden box, its lid sealed with rusted nails. She pried it open to reveal letters, personal belongings, and records detailing the lives of those buried alive. The box also contained a map, marking the location of the mass grave. Suddenly, the ground beneath her trembled, and a guttural voice growled, "Leave it buried." Shadows rose around her, coalescing into spectral forms that screamed in agony. Elena clutched the box tightly, knowing she couldn't stop now. Elena followed the map to the edge of the cemetery, where the land sloped into an overgrown hollow. There she found the mass grave, its markers long erased by time. She placed the box on the ground and began reciting the names of the forgotten souls, her voice trembling. The whispers turned to sobs, then silence. A brilliant light engulfed the cemetery, and the spectral forms appeared one last time, their faces now serene. Thomas's voice echoed faintly, thanking Elena for her courage. As the light faded, the cemetery returned to its stillness. The gate creaked open, and Elena walked out, feeling both relieved and forever changed. She vowed to tell the story of the forgotten souls so they would truly never be forgotten again.